back off. And we are going to go here. So higher order functions is what was on the curriculum for tonight, and I sent out the Eloquent JavaScript link. Um, I can cover higher order functions in maybe 2 sentences. Higher order functions are when you write a lot of code and the code keeps going and going and going, and then you have to start debugging that code, and you're going, all right, what's this section of the code doing? All right, I should write some comments on this. And now, okay, we're on to another section of the code. Rule of thumb that no function should be longer than 50 lines of code. If you're writing more than 50 lines, you should move it to another function. And you can call that function from a different function, and that's the notion of higher order, right? There is an order of the functions that you're calling. But the general rule of thumb is if you're writing more than 50 lines of code in a function, move it into another function and then name that function. So you know, okay, this block of code, the whole point of running this block of code is named in this function. And I know what I'm putting into it and I know what's coming out. And then I can go back to my main code and do some other things. And if I have another big idea that I have to do, right? If I have to make an API call to get data, and then I have to show that data on the screen, and I maybe have to manipulate it a little bit before it shows up. Instead of writing that in my main program block, I'm going to create a function called startup, right? Because I know this API call always happens at the beginning. And I'm going to make that API call, and when the data comes back, instead of manipulating the data there and say I have to add a 0 onto the end of the data that comes back, instead of adding it on right there, I might call a function that says add 0 to data. And I'm going to pass the data in from the API, and that function is going to return formatted data. And then I can just set the data. And now all of a sudden, because that's a separate function, it's going to be much easier to read that code. Higher order functions, great. We finished the curriculum for tonight.
Question.
Yes.
Is it kind of like referencing a style sheet in your HTML, so you're like calling it from somewhere else so it doesn't take up so much space in like one document?
Yes.
Okay.
It's less about it taking up space and more about being able to functionally read through your code.
Okay.
So the next thing I was going to bring up, which we want to tack onto this, is there's a concept in programming called DRY, D-R-Y, don't repeat yourself.
So it's like efficiency.
It's efficiency. So if you find yourself doing this thing over and over again, you want to turn that thing, instead of copying and pasting the code, you want to turn that into a higher order function, right? So common examples of this are I have this array of data and I want to filter through the array. And so to filter through the array, I need to write a loop for let I equal 0 while I is less than array.length I plus plus. Then I'm going to do my curly braces, and then I'm going to say if array bracket I is triple equal to this incoming value that I want to filter, then push it into this other array. Otherwise, don't push it, return that array back out. It's a lot of code, and it's kind of common for you to do something like that, right? So you might create a higher order function back pre-ES6 days, because there is now a method built into JavaScript to do this, by the way. But before the gods that create JavaScript or whoever it is um, set up these functions built in, it would be very common to have higher order functions to filter an array. And so because you have to loop through the array, you have to have an equality operator, you have to push whether that data should be in the new array. Because all of that's a lot of code, and because you would want to do that at a lot of different points in your code, you would create a higher order function called filter. Just like you may have, you look at your p tags in CSS and you go, okay, well, instead of putting a class on every single one of my p tags, I know that every single p tag on my website should be using Open Sans font instead of Helvetica or Times New Roman. I can just target that p tag and then reuse that p tag everywhere. The same concept is true for higher order functions. So dry is super important. I look for that in interview tests when people send me interview results, and I'm just like, really? You just copied and pasted this? Like, When you have the code organized in such a way that I can go to your main code block and just read out, here's the 10 things this program is going to do. And it's going to take 500 lines to do it. But because each one of them is in a named function, I can look at that program and go, great, we're going to get data. Get data from API, be specific. Okay, now that data comes back, what do we do with that data? Oh, we're going to format data for visualization. Okay, I'm going to go up to that function and it works with the objects and the arrays and does that stuff and great. All right, now there's another function, insert or generate visualization. All right, great. I go up and I read that stuff, right? Now you could take all that code and put it in one giant block and it would all run and it would all be fine. But the point of higher order functions is I can read through that and reuse some of that, right? Because I might make 10 API calls and that data might come in from 10 different sources and I need to format all of that data in a certain format. So because I can make those 10 API calls, I can now call in the API section the higher order function to format the data for the visualization. Um, so it's a really tough concept to teach now when you guys are writing programs that are 20, 30 lines long in JavaScript and you're like, I don't get higher order functions. But if we look at Free Code Camp, almost every exercise is built using a higher order function, kind of. So we notice here it's console logging out filtered array, right? Filtered array is a function up here. And so we could just take whatever code we're going to write in here and stick it in that console log and it would work. But we call it filtered array, we make our code specific and we use those variable names. Just like when we were doing those nested loops, you can call your variable I and j if you want. And if you can keep that straight in your head, great, the computer doesn't care. But I get lost in nested for loops, so I name my variables something more specific. When we're debugging, we know where in the loop we are, and it's much easier to follow. So higher order functions is a good concept. It's definitely good to use. The much more important concept is dry. Don't repeat yourself. So if you find yourself or writing this code over and over again or copying and pasting the code over and over again, make it a reusable function. Pass some data in with the parameters or the arguments, manipulate it, and then return it back in the function.
I have a question.
Sure.
Um, why is it called higher order function? Why isn't it just called function? Did I miss that?
Yeah, so functions are, this technically isn't a higher order function. A higher order function is typically when you use another function in a function. And it's called higher order because the order matters, right? So you're taking this block of code that's normally in a function and putting it at a higher order than the function you're running. And because that order matters, it's a higher order function. It's one of those concepts where like it was on the syllabus for today, and I was just like higher order functions. Kind of remember learning about that, but I don't remember it. And then I read the eloquent JavaScript, and I'm like, my God, why is this 9 pages? All they could say is just name variables and functions in a way that's easy to read. Keep your code in blocks or chunks that you can easily look at that whole thing and say, this is what this code does in one sentence. If you can't say what a function does in one sentence and have to explain it further, you need to make it another function. And you can use that other function in the function you're trying to write, but every function should really be able to be described in one sentence.
Is there a way to search through what you've written previously to find the functions? Like if you're like, oh, wait a minute, I did something like this once before for this other project.
Yeah, so
Like, how do you organize that?
So that's when you start getting into tools of an IDE as opposed to Visual Studio Code.
Mm-hmm.
Every time I make a criticism of Visual Studio Code, some fanboy of it will go, yeah, but you can do that if you install this extension, or yeah, you can do that if you know this hidden way of doing it. And they're totally right. And some people spend a ton of time setting up their extensions and getting it just the way they want, and There are some features that are built in that are just hard to find. In WebStorm, which is the IDE I use, and I believe Visual Studio Code supports this as well, you'll start writing programs that are a couple hundred or even 1,000 lines long. And it's very hard to go, okay, where is this variable initialized? I'm using it, I just don't know where it is. And so in WebStorm, and I believe Visual Studio Code as well, you can hold in Command and click on the variable name, and it will jump you up to the line that that variable is defined, or that function, or whatever it may be, and then it's much easier to read through that code. There are global find and replace tools as well, and that is built into Visual Studio Code. But the important thing is make sure you're naming your functions in a way that you can remember it. Other questions on higher order functions?
Like, is this sort of what folks mean when they say like reusable components?
That is the not exactly on higher order on functions, but reusable components are a component of dry code, which don't repeat yourself. So yes, reusable components themselves are a little different, and we're actually covering object-oriented JavaScript tomorrow, which will focus a lot on reusable code. But a reusable component is the same concept as a reusable function.
Oh, okay.
Yes. All right. I knew I was going to be able to cover that fast, and that's why I was so excited that Sean went over, because you guys were asking fantastic questions. What?
Yeah, I was a little worried about that. It's like, oh yeah, I'm gonna keep this guide and we gotta learn.
I have a couple things that I want to go through. I want to touch a little bit more time on combining loops with arrays and objects. So combining day 1 and 2 kind of today, and seeing how we can use loops specifically with arrays. Um, Wanted to do a quick little thing on multi-dimensional arrays. And then there are 2 algorithm things I would love to get to. One is called Chunky Monkey, and it takes a long array and then a parameter, and you use that parameter to break up the big array into smaller little chunks. And then there's another one called Record Collection, which they give you this object that I think is like 80 lines long. And you use different properties and go in and figure out how to access them. I don't think we're going to get to seek and destroy. It is an intermediate algorithm. But my goal is that by the end of this week, you guys will be able to do all the basic algorithms. And I believe that's where I did the homework for tonight. So the homework for tonight, do not try to complete all of it. I'm not asking you guys to do that. Go through the algorithms, pick out 2 or 3 that you think are fun, and try them. If you find you're flying through them and want a little bit more practice, by all means, continue going on them. But the basic algorithms is tonight's homework. So I'm just gonna kind of keep the flow going that we have been all week, and just go through a couple of these exercises just because I identified them as things that I use every day in work, and that things that I just think are super helpful, and then we'll go from there. Sound good? So I'm in basic data structures and iterate through all array items using for loops.
You already have the link up for that? Or it's on the main curriculum link, right?
Yeah.
Yes, yes. Curriculum under JavaScript algorithms and basic data structures. I'm wondering, I haven't already done this, have I? No. So I think we actually practiced this in our nested for loops, and this is just a little reinforcement time from yesterday's class. So filtered array wants to return anything that doesn't have the element that they're passing in it, right? So they're passing in a giant array here, and that giant array is made up of tiny little subarrays, and basically they pass in another parameter or argument. This one happens to be 3, and if 3 is found if 3 is found anywhere in the tiny little subarrays, then don't return that array. So what we're going to do, they call this new array.
Can you make that larger?
Oh, sure can.
Thank you.
Thank you for the reminder. So what we're going to do is we're going to write a for loop, and we're going to say for let, and because I'm using two loops, I'm not just going to say I'm going to say outer array. I'm sorry, I'm going to say outer index is equal to 0, while outer index is less than the array. And what I'm going to do is, I know they say don't change code above this line, but ARR is really unspecific, right? What array are we talking about? There's a big array, there's a little array. Outer and inner is how I tend to think. If you want to think about it as big array and little array, or big array and subarray, those are completely fine to call it that. Because I'm thinking of it as outer and inner, and what I mean by outer, I mean this whole big thing is the outer array, and then each one of these individual ones are going to be my inner array. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cheat, and instead of calling it ARR, I'm going to rename that parameter to outer array. And then I have my outer index, that's going to be my loop iterator, right? And then I'm going to say outer array length. And then I'm going to outer array plus plus.
Wait, so you're not incrementing the outer inner?
I'm not doing anything inner yet.
Oh, okay.
So basically what I'm doing is I'm setting up a loop to get this first, and then to get this, and then to get this, and then to get the last one.
Should that be outer index plus plus?
It sure should.
Oh.
Nice catch. So instead of working with two square brackets and getting confused, I'm now going to define what my inner array is. So I'm going to say const inner array is equal to my outer array with my outer index. And just so we know, we want to make sure we're following what's happening here, we're going to console log our inner array. And what we're going to get is 323, 163, 313, 26, all of those. So now we know, all right, we got access to this array as opposed to this giant one out here. So now that we have those, we need to loop through our inner array, right? So what we're going to say is for let inner index equals 0, while inner index is less than our inner array dot length inner index plus plus, and then I'm going to move our console log inside here, and I'm going to say inner array inner index, and I'm going to get each one of these numbers printing out 323 163 323 163 yada yada yada. Console logs don't matter to the computer, super important to you to make sure you know what your code is doing. So now that we're in here, we have our element, right? And so we want to think about what scope we're in, what bracket we're in, because that's going to control what loop is running. So our new array is out here, and what we want, can someone tell me what we want to do? We have this number 3 coming in. So we set our loops up, we have access to all the data. What are we trying to do?
Check for that 3.
Check for that 3. And if the 3 is there,
You want to remove it.
Kick it out, yeah.
so don't think about it as removing it, think about it as not adding it.
Like you're skipping it.
you're skipping it because new array is here. New array is what we're going to return. So instead of removing things out of the array that they're passing us in, instead we're only going to put things in that don't have that number in it.
Okay.
So what we're going to do is we're going to say if inner array bracket inner index. So now we have access to that 3 specifically, or the 2, or whatever, is triple equal to the element that they're passing in back up here. Then we are going to define a new variable out here, and I'm going to explain why in a second, called should add. And should add is going to be equal to true by default. So we're just going to assume that we should just add it. And now we're going to loop through each one of those sub-variables. And if the element that you find is in the element that we're looking for is in the array, we're going to say should add is equal to false. Now, we're getting lost in brackets, so it's important to remember where we're at. Let's look. If is running inside this for loop. So once we get outside of the for loop, we have now gone through each one of these numbers. So when we get to here, when we go through this one and this one and this one, if should add is still true, we're going to add it. If should add is not true, we're just going to keep going. So right here, we're going to say, let's check our for loop. We're out of our inner index, but we're still in our outer array. So before we go on to this one, we need to handle adding this. So what we're going to do is we're going to say new array dot, how do we add something to an array? And we're going to add our inner array. But we're only going to do that if should add. Now, you could just leave it like this. Just to be clear, we're going to say is equal to true. If you leave out an triple equal to true, it is assumed that you're checking if it's true. But we'll add it to be clear. I'll pull this over just so the code's a bit easier to read. And I'm going to run this, and then I'm going to go through ways to break it. And when we go through ways to break it, it might be a little more clear why we did the should add. Yeah. So, what if we say, let's start should add as false, right? We should be able to flip this, right? So let's say should add is equal to false. And then let's say if it is equal to the inner index, then should add is false. Else, should add should say true, right? Makes sense, kind of. If we run this, don't type this, by the way. This is ways to break it. If we run this, well, where did our green check mark go? We got 2 of them, but we broke this one. Okay, so let's go through and think like the computer. Why is the computer doing that? So the number is 3 that it's looking for, right? So it goes through and it goes 3 is in this array. So should add is now equal to false. But now we're going to keep looping through it. 2 is in this array. 2 is not equal to 3, so we should add it. Oh, but 3 is in this array. We shouldn't add it. So as long as there is something, if 3 is the last element, because what we're doing is we're overwriting. We don't care if should add is the last element. It's any element in it. So what we're basically doing is every time this loop runs, we're changing the value of should add. That's not what we want. We want it to say it doesn't matter if at any point should add is false. We shouldn't add it. So what we did, and the solution that was working, is that we said, let's assume that we should add it. And if at any point the inner array element is equal to the element being passed in, we're going to add should add to false. But now we're going to take out the else, and we're going to leave should add as true and only change it to false if the element is equal. So now what happens is we go through and we go 3. Should add is false now because we hit 3. 3 is equal to 3. 2. 2 is not equal to 3, but because we have no else statement in here, should add stays equal to false. We didn't flip it back to true. Okay, 3 is equal to 3. Should add was already false, but we'll make it false again. Computer doesn't care. Now we keep going through it. 1 is not equal to 3. 6 is not equal to 3. 3 is equal to 3. Should add becomes false. So should add is true. Should add is true. We don't change anything. We have no condition saying that it's changed. 3 is equal to 3. We don't add it to the array. So we go through each one of these, and each one of these has a 3 in it, so nothing comes out. And that's why our console log is empty. Now if we copy this whole thing into here, we have flutes and 4. Now why is that? Because we're going through and 2 is the deal breaker, right? If it finds a 2, it doesn't add it. So we're going to say, okay, trumpets not equal to 2. Should add stays true. 2 is equal to 2, we don't add should add. Okay, now we have looped through with this loop in particular those two elements. And because should add at some point got set to false, we're not going to push that into the new array. All right, you want the next element. We look there. Is flutes equal to 2? No. All right, don't touch should add. Should add still true. Is 4 equal to 2? No, it's not. Don't touch should add. Okay, now we've finished this for loop. We're outside of that. Let's keep running. Okay, is should add true? Yes, it is. So take that inner array, that thing that we just looped through and this, and push it into our answers that we're going to return, which we call new array. All right, now we hit down here, it goes back up to our outer for loop. Our outer for loop looks at it and goes, okay, you want this thing. Our inner for loop goes, okay, you want this value in particular. Is saxophones equal to 2? No, it's not. Should add stays true. Is 2 equal to 2? Yes, it is. Should add becomes false. We are out of our inner for loop. We go down here. Should add is not equal to true. It's false. We don't push it. We go to our outer for loop. Our outer for loop goes, nope, we're done running through the array. We come down here and we return new array. I went really fast on that. Do you guys want to go through it? Dave's here to help, and I can go through and talk it through if you guys are stuck somewhere.
I would like that.
Sure.
So, okay. So I don't know if it even works, because I'm not sure. I don't know the whole squiggle. All right.
So your closing parenthesis there. And then
Okay.
one thing that will really help you, Option Shift F. Now all of your code is lined up.
Oh.
So if you look at my code, everything's lined up, and you can see that we know that this if statement. So we know this if statement is happening inside this for loop. How do we know that? How do we know that this if statement is happening in this for loop? There are two answers. Because of the curly braces, but because I was good, how else do we know that for loop, this if statement is happening in the for loop?
Because you indented it.
Because I indented it.
Oh,
So now you can look at this and go, all right, anything that's one level more indented is going to be happening in this for loop. So we know this whole for loop is happening in this giant for loop. because it's indented,
Okay.
right? And so that makes it much easier. As a programmer, I'm not looking for where this curly brace ends. I am horrible at looking at curly braces and going, oh, this is the ending curly brace for that. But I can tell you it is because this curly brace is on the same indentation as this 4. And I know that this isn't the curly brace because it's not on that indentation.
Okay, that makes sense. So we'll just run it.
Sure.
See.
You got some syntax errors. So we have our opening.
This one. Okay.
We have our opening.
This is a square.
Not there. A little bit further over. Inner array, inner index. We open it and we close it right after. And we need one more.
I'm gonna return
Let me just check. I believe this, all of this, should just go a little bit higher. Cannot read 0 of undefined. So we celebrate different errors.
Yay.
People make fun of me for saying that, but we have a different error. That's good. We're
That's
making
good
progress.
Progress.
Okay, so type error unknown cannot read 0 of undefined. So instead of arr.outer array, it's just outer array. We got rid of arr and changed the name to outer array.
Okay.
Okay, let's give that a try. Still wasn't our problem. But that's okay. That would have come up next.
Okay.
New array const inner array is outer array, outer index. Should add is true, let inner index. Inner index should add. Oh, what'd you break?
I don't know. Let's see. Oh, wait, is this in there? Did you take that out?
Okay, you're double pushing. That should be around, yeah, so take that out. That's what we're doing in here.
Okay.
And let's rerun your indentation fix.
Option.
Shift F. Okay. And it's going to be something silly, I promise you.
Should we try it again?
Yeah, go for it. Oh. Oh, I hate it when it's something silly.
I always have something stupid.
It's like it's gonna be like
Now, it's not because you changed this? I know you did it on
I
yours.
did
Whenever I
change it
change
to
the
outer
buffer
array.
line, I have problems.
That's generally not encouraged, but for this problem in particular, I find it easier to follow.
It's not because I use const instead of tar. I mean,
Not
you
in
did
this
it.
one.
So if you have YouTube running in the background, YouTube channel running in the background,
It is 8:30, guys.
We need to know that.
Sorry, we only got to one exercise. Was this a good one to go over?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
I'm sorry that I powered through it. If you guys have any questions, we can go through it tomorrow. I'm trying to get through as many algorithms as you want. You might get frustrated. It's completely okay. When you come in tomorrow, we're going to do a little bit more with loops around objects and arrays, and we're going to play around with record collection. And we're going to try and cover a little bit of object-oriented programming as well. I hesitate on teaching that, and the reason behind that is because JavaScript was not initially an object-oriented language, and things like React, which is now super modern, use object-oriented programming, but object-oriented programming comes up all the time on interview questions, and it is a good thing to have, and newer JavaScript frameworks are definitely using it. So I'm going to try and cover as little as possible with object-oriented so you guys can fly through interviews, and then get back to the stuff that really matters, which is working with datas and loops and stuff like that. So we'll see you all tomorrow. If you haven't submitted homework, try and get your homework submitted by Friday. I'm going to give you guys feedback on the homework, so it's not just like, oh, I can check it off, but I will try and give feedback. And then office hours are going to be Friday from 6:30 to 8:30. I'm going to do it on the YouTube Hangout, or I'm sorry, on the YouTube live stream. Submit any questions on Slack. And a follow-up question for that is, would anyone prefer them to be in person? Okay, then that is going to be Friday, 6:30 to 8:30. Get all your questions submitted on Slack, and I'll be live on YouTube.
What does line 1 and 2 say up there? Can you scroll
Sure.
down?
Yeah,
Can I ask you one more? Especially at that time.
No.
But other people might have free code camp questions, and this is about elephant JavaScript.
Oh,
so.
sure.
Well, actually, I was going to say maybe it would be the same thing. So I wanted to look up something else for the higher functions.
Yes.
So I came across this blog.
Mm-hmm.
What is this? He uses filter. So we use filters, then we also use math.
Mm-hmm.
How close are they and what they do?
Very similar. They both loop, right? So they both, in order to filter something, you need to check every single thing in the array to see if it exists there.
Okay.
Math, on the other hand, you still are looping, but with filtering, you're trying to take things out of the array. With math, you're trying to create a new array.
Okay.
So just like what we did here, where instead of thinking about it as taking it out of the array, instead we put it in the array. So we could have used .map in this.
Well, because that's but the other thing I was reading on the side there for that exercise, and it said something about .map, and I'm like, okay, that's the second time I've seen that in like a matter of 10 minutes. So I wanted to know how similar. Why? Oh, now you think I'm crazy.
It's a good refresher though. I'm doing a nested. Okay. Alright. So I just want to, like, it says apply velocity, but I just want to make sure that.
No, it's not going to be in day 4 exercises.
It's like.
Oh, I didn't cover it because it's ES6, and Joey's going to do it in week 4, or week 4 of JavaScript.
Mapping.
Map.
Okay. Because it was because the exercise that we just did, like if you go down.
3 arrays. Right. 4 arrays.
Somewhere it said.
Did you go to get a hand?
Okay. So
No,
I'm saying that's
I
fine.
was just reading.
Or ask for help?
Nope.
It's kind of hard the way.
Oh, I'm sorry, I
have it,
didn't
but
mean
anyway.
Bob.
Can I, do you mind if I take a quick look?
I'm going to